The storm swallowed the ridge whole, and somewhere inside it, 3 American airmen were dying by inches. In the packing shed at the edge of the flight line, Sergeant Sloane Merrick knelt over a parachute canopy with her hands steady, unaware that in 4 hours she would be the only person on the installation willing to jump into that black sky. The wind outside had already torn a hangar door off 2 of its hinges. Radar returns from the weather station showed a wall of cloud stacked 11,000 feet high, rolling east off the coastal range and swallowing the ridgeline whole, mile by mile, like a hand closing over a candle. Nobody had planned for this. The mission that morning had been routine to the point of boredom. A rescue helicopter running a personnel recovery training sortie over the high country, practicing hoist extractions with a 2-man crew and a flight engineer riding in back to call the numbers. Then the weather closed faster than the forecast said it could. Wind shear hit the aircraft broadside over a saddle between 2 peaks, and the pilot did the only thing that kept them alive. He put the aircraft down hard on a shelf of rock and scrub pine at 9,000 feet, in country that had no name on most maps and no road within 20 miles. The distress call had come in garbled, half swallowed by static, the pilot's voice flat with the practiced calm of a man fighting panic and losing. "Any station. This is Rescue 16. We are down. Repeat. We are down. Ridge position approximate. We have injuries. We have injuries." Then nothing. The beacon kept transmitting a location that drifted with every gust, a blinking dot on a screen in the command post that told everyone exactly where the 3 men were and exactly how impossible it was to reach them. Base operations tried everything in the first 2 hours. They spun up 2 more helicopters and grounded them before the rotors turned, because flying into that wall of weather would have made 4 crews stranded instead of 1. They tried a fixed-wing overflight, and the pilot turned back at 15 miles out, white-knuckled, reporting turbulence that had thrown his aircraft 200 feet without warning. They called the nearest mountain rescue team, 40 miles by road that the storm had already buried under 2 feet of snow. Every option collapsed the same way. The weather didn't care about rank, urgency, or how many lives were on the line. It simply would not let anyone through. By the 2nd hour, the command post had stopped debating whether to try again and started debating whether trying again was even responsible. The weather officer, a soft-spoken captain named Ibarra, kept updating the same chart with worse numbers each time. Sustained winds now gusting past 40 knots along the ridge crest. Cloud ceiling collapsing toward the deck. Temperatures sliding a degree every 20 minutes as full dark settled in. She'd stopped saying the storm might weaken by midnight. Nobody in the room believed that anymore. What she said instead, flatly to anyone who asked, was that conditions were still getting worse, not better, and that any aircraft launched into that ridge in the next several hours would very likely become a second incident instead of a rescue for the first one. Colonel Reeves Fenn stood in the command post with his hands flat on the map table, listening to the same brutal arithmetic every operations officer in the room had already run in his head. 3 men down. Confirmed injuries, severity unknown. Ambient temperature on the ridge already below freezing and falling with the storm. No ground team could reach them before dark. No aircraft could reach them at all. The math didn't just look bad. It looked like a foregone conclusion, the kind that gets written up afterward in careful, bloodless language that never quite says what everyone in the room already knew, that sometimes the weather wins, and the calendar simply records how many names it took. It was Master Sergeant Del Prentice, the loadmaster shop chief, who first said what everybody else was thinking but wouldn't say out loud. "We don't have a jumper for this. Everybody who's rated for this kind of insertion is either on leave or grounded for the same weather that put those boys on the ground." He wasn't wrong. The unit's designated static line jumpmasters were split between two exercises on the other side of the country. The one qualified freefall team on base had deployed 6 days earlier. What remained were pilots who couldn't fly, a mountain rescue team that couldn't drive, and a rigger shop full of technicians whose entire job, as far as most of the base understood it, was to fold fabric into a pack tray and sign a card certifying that someone else's parachute would open. Word of the crash moved through the base the way it always did on nights like this, fast, hushed, incomplete. Airmen drifted toward the flight line in 2s and 3s, standing at a respectful distance from the operations building, watching the lit windows for some sign of what was happening, feeling the particular helplessness of an entire installation that wanted badly to do something and had nothing to offer but waiting. In the dining facility, a television played news unrelated to any of it, ignored. In the barracks, phones stayed in pockets because nobody wanted to be the one talking when word finally came. It was, everyone would later agree, the kind of night that makes an entire base feel very small and very far from anywhere that could help. Sloane Merrick heard about the crash the way everyone else did, over the shop radio, a voice reading coordinates in a tone that made the whole room go quiet. She set down the canopy she'd been inspecting, walked to the doorway, and looked north at the black wall rolling toward the base, and something in her chest went very still and very cold. The particular stillness of a person doing math she already knew the answer to. 3 men, 19-degree wind chill and dropping, no aircraft flying, no ground team arriving before morning if then. She had spent 4 years of her life training for exactly this kind of night, and she had spent the 2 years since walking away from it, telling herself the walking away was permanent. She didn't say anything yet. She went back to her bench, finished the inspection she'd started, and began, very quietly, checking her own gear. To the rest of the base, Sloane Merrick was simply the rigger. She worked the packing tables in a low cinderblock building at the edge of the flight line, 6 days a week, folding and inspecting and repacking the canopies that kept air crews and jumpers alive without ever asking any of them for a word of thanks. It was careful, unglamorous, essential work, the kind that only gets noticed when it fails, and Merrick had never once let it fail. Her packing cards were immaculate. Her inspection log ran back 2 years without a single deficiency. Pilots requested her by name for their emergency chutes, not because they knew anything about her, but because word had gotten around the squadron that Merrick's rigs were the ones you trusted with your life, without thinking twice. Once, 7 months earlier, a first-time static line jumper on a training exercise had frozen in the door mid-refusal. One boot hooked wrong in the anchor line, panic spreading fast through the aircraft over the intercom. It was Merrick's voice that came across the radio from the ground, calm and specific, walking the jumpmaster through exactly how to clear the hang-up in the time available, her instructions so precise and so unhurried that the entire aircrew assumed afterward she must have read it out of a manual. Nobody thought to ask why a rigger's voice carried that particular certainty, the certainty of someone who has talked people through worse than a hung static line, more than once, with far less time to spare. Merrick never mentioned it again. She simply went back to her bench the next morning, and the base moved on, because that was how these things always went when nobody was looking for the pattern underneath them. What almost nobody on base knew was that 2 years earlier, in a different uniform patch and a different unit entirely, Sloane Merrick had worn a maroon beret. She never talked about it, and the file that would have explained it sat behind a classification marking that kept the details out of casual conversation. What people saw instead was a quiet, competent technician who kept to herself, ate lunch alone at the end of the rigger shop's long table, and flinched, almost imperceptibly, whenever anyone mentioned pararescue operations on the news. The unit had absorbed her into its routine, the way units absorb anyone who does good work and doesn't cause trouble, with mild, incurious acceptance. Nobody asked why a woman with a body conditioned like an athlete's, who moved with the balance of someone who'd spent years on ropes and rock and open aircraft doors, had ended up folding fabric for a living. It simply wasn't anyone's business, and Merrick had made very sure it stayed that way. Del Prentice had never been cruel about it. Not exactly. He was the kind of non-commissioned officer who believed in hard lines and clear lanes, the kind who'd spent 18 years learning exactly what his job required and exactly what it didn't, and who distrusted anyone who blurred those lines. He liked Merrick's work fine. He simply didn't think a rigger belonged anywhere near a jump door, and he said so, more than once, in the easy, half-joking tone men use when they think they're only stating the obvious. "Riggers pack chutes," he'd told her once, months earlier, when she'd asked, almost carefully, almost testing the water, whether the unit ever cross-trained its packers on static line procedures. "They don't jump. That's not an insult, Merrick. That's just how the job works. You keep us safe from the ground. Let the jump-qualified people handle the falling part." There was a reason Prentice held that line so hard, though he'd never once explained it to Merrick or to anyone else in the shop. 19 years earlier, as a young loadmaster himself, he'd watched a friend go out a jump door on a nothing-special training run and never come home. A chain of small decisions and a moment of overconfidence that added up, by the time anyone understood what was happening, to a funeral with a folded flag and a mother who never fully recovered. Prentice had spent every year since building his corner of the Air Force into a place where that particular kind of loss couldn't happen again on his watch, where lanes stayed clean, and nobody who wasn't rated took a risk they hadn't trained 1,000 times over. It made him rigid sometimes, and it made him occasionally unfair to people who deserved better. But it came from the same place all his best qualities came from. He had buried someone once, and he had promised himself he'd do everything in his power never to do it again. She'd said nothing back then. She'd only nodded, filed the comment away with all the others, and gone back to her bench. It wasn't that Prentice was a bad man. He'd trained half the loadmasters on the flight line, he ran a tight shop, and he genuinely believed he was protecting people by keeping them inside their lanes. Protecting Merrick from a decision he assumed she hadn't thought through. Protecting the mission from anyone underqualified, taking an unnecessary risk. He simply had no way of knowing that the woman he was gently steering away from the jump door had once static-lined into worse weather than this on a moonless night, with 3 times the gear on her back and half the margin for error, because somebody's life had depended on her getting there before the cold did. That afternoon, as word of the downed aircrew spread through the unit like a current through water, Merrick stood at the edge of the flight operations building and listened to the same conversation repeat itself in different voices. No jumper, no aircraft, no way in. And she felt the old creed rise up in her chest unbidden. 4 words she had sworn she'd left behind with the beret, that others may live. She had told herself, the day she turned in that beret, that the words weren't hers to carry anymore. She had told herself a great many things in the 2 years since, most of them for the specific purpose of getting through each day without looking too closely at what she'd surrendered and why. She walked into the operations building anyway. That was the choice, and it mattered, though nobody in the room understood yet just how much it would come to matter for 3 men who didn't yet know her name. Colonel Fenn was still at the map table when she came through the door. "Colonel," she said, and her voice didn't shake even a little. "I need 5 minutes." Prentice, standing near the coffee station with his arms crossed, glanced over and gave her a look that wasn't unkind, only baffled. "Merrick, this isn't a rigger problem. Go on back to the shop. We've got operations working it." "I know what it is," she said. "That's why I'm here." Colonel Fenn had run 22 years in uniform, most of them in units that specialized in exactly the kind of impossible decision now sitting on his map table. And he had learned a long time ago that the worst moments of command were never the ones with too many options. They were the ones with none. He listened to his operations officer lay out the same conclusion 3 different ways and arrive at the same wall each time. The storm had a floor of roughly 900 feet and visibility measured in yards, gusts strong enough to cartwheel a loaded aircraft, and a forecast that showed no meaningful break for at least 18 hours. Every aircraft on the field was grounded by regulation and by plain physical reality. The nearest usable road ended in snow 22 miles from the crash site. A ground party on foot, even moving fast, wouldn't reach the ridge before the following afternoon. And by then, the question wouldn't be rescue. It would be recovery. On the radio net, the survivors were still transmitting, faint and intermittent, a young voice fighting to keep itself level. "Command! This is Yoon. Flight engineer, rescue 1-6. Pilot's got a broken leg. Can't put weight on it. I've got a dislocated shoulder working on getting it stabilized. Our loadmaster." A pause, breath audible even through the static. "Our loadmaster's the youngest of us, and he's not doing good. He's shaking bad, sir. He stopped talking as much as he was an hour ago. We need somebody. We need somebody bad." In the 15 minutes before Merrick walked through that door, the command post had cycled through every alternative anyone could think of and discarded each one in turn. Someone floated the idea of driving a snowcat up an old logging road that dead-ended 6 miles short of the ridge, and someone else pointed out that 6 miles of unbroken alpine terrain in the dark, in that wind, would take a fit ground team the better part of a day, even without carrying casualties back out. Someone else asked about a night vision overflight at a higher altitude, above the worst of the turbulence, and the answer came back that the cloud tops were running higher than any aircraft on the field could safely operate above, while still descending fast enough to do anyone on the ground any good. Each idea died the same way. Sound on paper, impossible against the actual storm sitting over that ridge. The name on the crash manifest for the loadmaster was Airman First Class Wyatt Boyd, 19 years old, 6 months out of technical school, on his second training flight with the squadron. The pilot was Staff Sergeant Booker Nash, a broad-shouldered career flyer with a reputation for bringing damaged aircraft home in one piece, now immobilized by a leg he couldn't stand on. The flight engineer transmitting the calls was Senior Airman Ansel Yoon, 24. Steady-voiced even now, doing everything one working arm and a stubborn refusal to panic could manage for 2 injured men in a storm that was actively trying to kill all 3 of them by increments. First the wind, then the wet, then the cold, then, if nobody came, the long silence after. Fenn looked at the map, at the little blinking dot that represented 3 lives, and understood with total clarity that regulation, procedure, and every ounce of institutional caution built into 30 years of accident prevention all pointed the same direction. Wait for the weather. Nobody flies. Nobody jumps. You do not spend a 4th life chasing 3, however much it costs you to say so out loud. It was the correct call by every measure that mattered to the institution. It was also, Merrick knew standing in that doorway, a decision that guaranteed at least one of those men, probably the youngest, the one already going quiet on the radio, would not survive the night. She had done this math before. She still remembered exactly how it felt to run it 2 years earlier, on a different ridge in a different country that nobody back home would ever hear the name of, when a recovery she had led went wrong in a way that still visited her in the hours before dawn. She was not the same person who had walked away from that mission still questioning every choice she'd made. But the math itself hadn't changed. It never did. Weather doesn't negotiate, cold doesn't wait for a duty roster to clear, and every hour spent debating whether to act was an hour that came directly out of Wyatt Boyd's chances. She thought, too, about what it would mean to say nothing, to let the room keep spinning through options that wouldn't work, to let the night simply happen the way nights like this sometimes happen, and to go home afterward having done nothing wrong by any regulation, having broken no rule, having simply stood by while the math ran its course. She had done that once already, in her own way, by turning in the beret, instead of trusting herself with another decision, like the one that broke her. She understood now, watching the clock on the wall tick past another precious minute, that there were two ways to fail somebody: by making the wrong call under pressure, and by refusing to make any call at all, because you were afraid of what making one might cost you a second time. "Sir," she said, stepping fully into the room now, "I'm qualified for a static line insertion in conditions like this. I have the training, I have the experience, and I am the only person on this base tonight who's willing to hook up and go." The room went quiet in the particular way rooms go quiet when someone says something too large to immediately process. Prentice actually laughed, a short, disbelieving sound before he caught himself. "Merrick, I know you mean well, but this isn't the kind of thing you volunteer for because you feel bad about the radio call. This is a technical night jump into mountain terrain in a storm that just turned back a full aircrew 15 miles out. You're a rigger." "I'm also a former para-rescue man," she said, and the words came out of her flat and unadorned, stripped of everything except the plain fact of them, because there was no time left to make them sound gentler. "I completed the pipeline. I served 4 years on recovery operations before I transferred into rigging. I have jumped into worse than this. I am telling you the truth because 3 men on that ridge don't have time for me to be modest about it." Fenn studied her for a long moment, the kind of look a career officer gives someone claiming something enormous with no visible proof, weighing whether what he was hearing was desperation or fact. Then he did what good commanders do in the absence of certainty. He asked the one question that mattered. "Can you get down there alive, Sergeant? And can you keep 3 men alive until this weather breaks?" "Yes, sir," Merrick said. "But you have to let me leave in the next 20 minutes before the ceiling drops any further, or the answer changes to no." There was a brief, furious argument in the command post that Merrick mostly let happen around her while she worked, because arguing wasn't going to get her out the door and packing her own gear was. Someone raised the obvious question of proof, records, verification, a call to a personnel office that would take hours she didn't have, and Fenn cut it off himself, because he had spent 2 decades learning to read the difference between a person overselling their own courage and a person stating a fact they wished wasn't true. Merrick wasn't performing. She was already suited up. She moved through her own equipment with a fluency that told its own story better than any file could have. She selected a modified static line rig built for mountain insertions in high wind, checked her own reserve. With the same unhurried thoroughness, she gave every canopy that passed through her hands, and packed a jump bag with a compact medical kit, emergency bivvy shelters, chemical heat sources, a portable radio, and a coil of rope, moving through the checklist from muscle memory that hadn't faded in 2 years of trying to forget it. Prentice, watching from a few feet away, said nothing for a long stretch, his earlier certainty visibly cracking under the evidence in front of him. The economy of her movements, the total absence of hesitation, the particular calm of someone who has done exactly this kind of preparation many times before, under exactly this kind of pressure. A crew chief named Ortiz, who'd loaded 1,000 pallets and never once a jumper, hovered near the ramp asking questions Merrick answered without looking up. Canopy size for the wind loading, reserve deployment altitude, whether she wanted extra chem lights clipped to her harness in case the beacon receiver failed. She wanted them. She also asked him to run a weight check on her jump bag twice, because the difference of a few pounds mattered more in wind like this than it ever did on a calm day training jump. And because she had learned a long time ago that the checks that felt excessive were usually the ones that saved a life later. Ortiz watched her work with the particular attentiveness of a man realizing in real time, that he was looking at someone who had done this exact kind of preparation more times than he had loaded aircraft, and said quietly, before he stepped back, "Good luck out there, Sergeant." Merrick didn't look up. "Not luck," she said. "Just the checklist. Luck's what happens to people who skip it." "Why didn't you ever say anything?" Prentice finally asked, quieter than she'd heard him speak all evening. "Because it wasn't going to change how I packed a chute," she said, not unkindly, cinching a strap tight. "And because some things you leave behind for reasons that are your own business, not the shop's." She paused, glanced at him, and something passed between them that wasn't quite an apology from either side, only an acknowledgement that the ground beneath their working relationship had just shifted permanently. "I need you to do something for me, Del. If the aircraft can't hold this course long enough to get me a clean spot, I need a jumpmaster who trusts my read of it more than the checklist does. Will you do the door for me?" Prentice looked at her for a long moment, then nodded once, hard. "Yeah, Merrick, I'll do the door." The only aircraft on the field with any hope of getting close was a rescue helicopter whose pilot, a grim, sharp-eyed captain named Ruiz, agreed to attempt a single high pass along the leeward side of the ridge, below the worst of the rotor turbulence, on the understanding that if conditions worsened even slightly beyond what he'd briefed, he was turning back, regardless of who was still in the cabin. It was a narrow, ugly kind of risk calculus, the sort that gets made only when the alternative risk is worse, and everyone in that cabin understood it. The flight out was violent, even by the standards of people who flew for a living. The aircraft bucked and dropped and clawed sideways in gusts that made the airframe groan, red instrument lighting, throwing everyone's face into hard, shadowed relief, sleet hammering the windscreen in sheets that turned the world outside into a smear of gray and black. Merrick sat near the open door with her static line clipped and her hands resting loosely on her knees. And if she was afraid, nothing on her face showed it. She had learned a long time ago that fear, held right, was just information, and that the people who survived nights like this were the ones who let it sharpen them instead of shake them. She spent the flight doing the thing she had trained herself to do years earlier in aircraft exactly like this one, narrowing the enormous, frightening size of the night down to the next small task in front of her. Not the whole storm, not the whole ridge, just the static line, clipped and checked, just the exit count, 4 steps to the door, just the picture in her mind of where the drop zone had to be, built from a beacon signal and a topographic map she'd memorized in the 10 minutes before boarding. Fear, she'd learned long ago, grew enormous the moment you let it look at the whole problem at once. Discipline was just fear, cut into pieces small enough to carry. Ruiz's voice came back over the intercom, tight with concentration. 60 seconds to the drop zone, if you can call it that. I've got maybe a 90-second window before I have to pull off this line regardless of where you are in your exit. Winds running 28, gusting to 35 out of the northwest. This is about as ugly as it gets, Sergeant. Copy, Merrick said. I've jumped uglier. Prentice crouched at the door with one hand locked on the static line anchor, looked back at her one last time before the light went green. Whatever doubt had lived in him for the 2 years he'd known her was gone from his face now, replaced by something closer to awe. And under the awe, a plain, uncomplicated fear for her safety that surprised him even as he felt it. "Go with God, Kestrel," he said, using the old call sign that had been buried in her file, the one he'd only just learned that night, and something in Merrick's chest tightened at hearing it spoken out loud again after 2 years of silence. The light went green. She went out the door into the storm, and the black sky closed over her exactly the way it had closed over the ridge 4 hours earlier, taking her with it. The static line did its work exactly as it was built to, snapping the canopy open hard above her in a violent, bone-jarring deployment that the wind immediately tried to twist into a collapse. Merrick fought the risers with both hands, reading the gusts the way she'd been trained to read them years earlier, feeding line to spill the worst of the turbulence and hauling it back the instant a window opened. And somewhere in the screaming dark below her a shelf of rock and scrub pine rose up faster than she expected. She hit hard, rolled the way every good landing rolls, felt the cold bite through her gloves as she clawed the canopy in before the wind could drag her off the ledge, and for one long moment she simply lay still on the frozen ground, letting her body confirm that everything still worked. Then she got up, because 3 men several hundred yards away were running out of time, and finding them in a whiteout with a handheld beacon receiver and her own memory of the coordinates was the easy part of what was coming. She found the wreckage 40 minutes later, guided by the beacon signal and, in the last 100 yards, by Yoon's voice calling out into the wind when he heard her boots on the rock. The scene that greeted her was exactly as bad as the radio call had suggested, and somehow still worse in person. The helicopter canted on its side against an outcrop. One rotor blade snapped and buried in snow. The cabin partially collapsed, but intact enough that the 3 men had been able to shelter inside it, huddled together for warmth that wasn't nearly enough against a wind chill now well below 0. Nash's leg was splinted crudely with a strut from the wreckage, his face pale and set against pain he was refusing to voice. Yoon had gotten his own shoulder into some rough approximation of stable, and had spent the last several hours doing everything a person with one working arm could do to keep the youngest man among them breathing and talking. And Boyd, 19 years old, 6 months out of technical school, had stopped shivering, which Merrick knew from hard experience was not a sign of improvement. It was the body giving up the fight to stay warm. What followed was 19 hours that none of the 4 of them would ever fully describe to anyone who hadn't lived through a night like it, because there simply weren't words efficient enough to carry the reality of it. The relentless, grinding work of keeping 3 cold, injured, frightened men alive through a storm that showed no interest in relenting. Merrick got the emergency shelters up against the worst of the wind, working with numb fingers by feel as much as by sight. She distributed the chemical heat packs with the discipline of someone who understood exactly how few of them she had and exactly how much each one mattered, prioritizing Boyd without making it obvious to him that he was the one she was most worried about, because a frightened 19-year-old needed to believe he was going to be fine, not watch 3 adults confirm that he might not be. She kept them talking, because talking kept minds present, and presence kept people from sliding somewhere colder and darker than the weather. She traded body heat where it counted, packed injured limbs to keep them stable, rationed the little water and food in her jump bag, with the ruthless fairness of someone doing arithmetic she couldn't afford to get wrong. There were setbacks that tested every ounce of the calm she'd trained herself to hold. Around hour 7, a fresh band of wind tore one corner of the emergency shelter loose from its anchor. And for several long minutes, Merrick fought the fabric in the dark with fingers that had gone past cold into something closer to numb, aware the entire time that losing the shelter meant losing the only real barrier between 3 injured men and a wind chill that would finish what the crash had started. She got it re-anchored using a spare length of parachute cord and sheer stubbornness, tying knots she couldn't fully feel by memory alone. And when it held, she allowed herself exactly 1 breath of relief before turning back to Boyd, whose breathing had gone shallow and uneven in the minutes she'd spent fighting the wind. She talked him back to steadier breaths, the way she'd once talked frightened strangers through worse, in a voice that never once let him hear how close that shelter had come to failing. Hour by hour, she held the line against the 2 forces that kill people in weather like that faster than any wound does. The cold, working its way through every gap in clothing and resolve, and the despair, the quiet voice that tells a hurting, exhausted person that giving up is easier than continuing to fight for a rescue that might never come. She fought the despair as hard as she fought the cold, because she understood, from a night 2 years earlier, that she still carried with her exactly how fast hope could collapse in the dark, and exactly what it cost when nobody was there to hold it up. Somewhere around hour 11, with the wind screaming outside the collapsed cabin and Boyd drifting in and out of a shallow, frightening half-sleep, Yoon asked her the question all three of them had clearly been circling for hours. "You're not just a rigger. Nobody moves like you move, talks like you talk out here. Who are you?" Merrick was quiet for a long moment, keeping her hands busy tucking a shelter blanket tighter around Boyd's shoulders, before she answered. "I used to do this for a living. A long time before I packed a single parachute for anybody else." She didn't say more than that, not because she owed them nothing, but because the whole truth was heavier than the moment could carry, and because right then the only thing that mattered was getting Boyd to hour 12, and then 13, and then whatever came after that. What she didn't say out loud, not to Yoon, not to Nash, not to herself in any way she let show on her face, was the memory that kept surfacing anyway in the gaps between tasks. Another ridge, another storm, a recovery 2 years earlier, where she had made a call under pressure that hadn't gone the way she'd trained for, where the outcome had haunted her long enough and hard enough that she had turned in her beret rather than risk making that same call again with someone else's life in her hands. She had told herself, walking away, that she wasn't fit to carry that responsibility anymore. Sitting on that ridge with 3 men's lives balanced against her judgment and her endurance, she understood something she hadn't let herself understand in 2 years, that the mistake she carried hadn't been a failure of skill. It had been the brutal, unfair math of an impossible night, the same kind of night she was living through again right now, except this time she wasn't running from the responsibility. She was choosing it with clear eyes, because 3 men needed exactly what she still had to give. She let herself, for the first time in 2 years, forgive the version of herself that had made a different call on a different night, in a different storm, under a weight of uncertainty nobody who hadn't lived it could fully judge. She had spent 2 years believing that walking away had been the responsible thing, the safe thing, the thing that kept anyone else from paying for a mistake that was hers alone to carry. Sitting on that ridge with her hands numb and 3 men's lives resting on her judgment, she understood, with a clarity that felt almost physical, that safety had never really been the point. Showing up had always been the point. Somebody had needed her 2 years ago, and she hadn't been able to save him. 3 men needed her tonight, and this time, she was not going to let the fear of failing again be the reason she failed to try. By hour 15, the worst of the storm's fury had begun to bend, not break, the wind dropping from a scream to a howl, visibility opening in short, teasing windows before closing again. Merrick used every one of those windows to check her patience, to keep Boyd talking about anything, his hometown, his mother's cooking, the girl he'd been too nervous to ask out before he shipped to technical school, because a voice describing ordinary things was a voice that was still fighting. Nash, gray with pain but stubbornly alert, started cracking dry jokes about riggers and jump doors that made Yoon laugh despite everything, and Merrick let him, because laughter in that cabin was its own kind of heat. She kept her patience oriented to time in small, deliberate ways, because a mind that loses track of time in weather like that starts losing track of hope not long after. She named the hours out loud as they passed, turned survival into something countable, and thereby something bearable. She kept them moving what could be moved, flexing fingers and toes inside their layers, because stillness was its own kind of danger in cold that patient. She watched all 3 of them for the subtle signs she'd been trained years earlier to catch and never forget. Confusion where there should be clarity, indifference where there should be worry, the particular quiet of a person's body starting to prioritize its core over its edges, and she adjusted constantly, shifting a blanket here, a body position there, a word of encouragement timed exactly when someone's voice started to flatten out towards silence. By hour 18, the sky had cleared enough that Merrick could see stars for the first time since she'd left the aircraft, hard, bright points overhead that meant, finally, that somewhere behind her, a helicopter crew was already spinning rotors. She radioed her position, gave Ruiz's relief pilot the clearest possible picture of 3 patients and their conditions, and then did the only thing left to do. She kept talking to Boyd, kept him with her, kept the cold from winning in the final stretch, when exhaustion made everyone, including her, most vulnerable to letting go. At hour 19, the thunder of rotor blades broke over the ridge, and the first gray light of morning showed 3 airmen alive, cold, battered, and breathing, and one rigger who had never once in 19 hours stopped being exactly what she'd trained years earlier to be. The extraction was fast and almost anticlimactic after everything that had come before it. A hoist, a careful lift, 4 bodies pulled up into the cabin of a helicopter that had waited on this exact break in the weather for hours, hovering just beyond the ridge until the ceiling finally lifted enough to make the approach survivable. Nash was carried off on a litter, already needling the flight medic about how a broken leg was nothing compared to 19 hours of Merrick's dry commentary on wind drift. Yoon walked off under his own power, one arm in a sling, insisting 3 separate times that Merrick be the first one checked by the flight surgeon, not him. Boyd, wrapped in blankets, and finally, blessedly, shivering again, a sign this time of a body warming back up rather than one shutting down, reached out from his litter as it passed her on the tarmac, and gripped her hand hard enough that she felt it through her glove, and said nothing at all, because there wasn't anything that needed saying. At the aid station, while a flight surgeon checked her for frostbite and exhaustion, Nash caught her eye from the next litter over and said, in the dry, understated way of a man who'd nearly died 12 hours earlier and was already turning it into a story he'd tell for the rest of his career, "Next time the weather looks like that, Sergeant, I'm requesting you specifically." Yoon, still favoring his splinted shoulder, added that he intended to tell every loadmaster he ever trained the exact rank and job title of the person who'd kept them alive, specifically so nobody in his shop ever again assumed a rigger's job stopped at the packing table. Boyd didn't say much of anything, not yet. But 3 days later, when he was well enough to walk down to the rigger shop on his own, he stood in the doorway for a long moment before he managed to say thank you, and Merrick told him the only thing she thought he needed to hear, that he'd done the hardest part himself, simply by not giving up on the ridge when giving up would have been so much easier. The base had gathered by the time the aircraft touched down. Word of the rescue having traveled the way word always travels on a small installation. Fast, garbled, and somehow entirely accurate by the time it reached the flight line. Colonel Fenn walked out to meet the helicopter himself, and when Merrick stepped off the ramp, gray with exhaustion, frost still crusted in her hair, he didn't return her salute right away. He looked at her for a long moment, the way a man looks at someone he has badly misjudged, and then he did return it, sharp and correct, holding it a beat longer than regulation required. That afternoon, with the storm finally spent and the whole unit assembled on the flight line at Fenn's order, the colonel stood in front of the formation with a single sheet of paper in his hand, the one unclassified line his authority allowed him to read from a file that would otherwise stay sealed. His voice carried clean across the tarmac in the cold, still air. Sergeant Sloane Merrick, prior service, completed pararescue training, and served with distinction on personnel recovery operations before transferring to the parachute rigger career field. Last night, this airman conducted a solo static line insertion into severe weather conditions to reach a downed air crew, and sustained a 19-hour rescue effort resulting in the survival of 3 service members. He folded the paper, looked out at the formation, and added words that weren't in the file at all, only in him. I have served with a great many operators in this career. I have never seen courage like what I watched broadcast on that radio last night. This unit owes Sergeant Merrick a debt we are not going to forget. Del Prentice didn't say anything when the formation broke. He simply walked across the tarmac to where Merrick's jump rig sat, storm-battered and still crusted with ice, and picked it up himself, slinging it over one shoulder to carry it back to the shop. The same gear he'd once told her a rigger like her had no business wearing outside a packing shed. He fell into step beside her without a word, and after a while, he said quietly, "I was wrong about you. I want you to know I know that." Merrick looked at him, and something eased in her chest that had been tight for 2 years. "You weren't wrong about the job, Del," she said. "Riggers do pack chutes. I just also happen to jump." In the days that followed, the story moved through the base and then beyond it the way stories like this always do. Softened in some retellings, sharpened in others, but always circling back to the same 2 facts that needed no embellishment. 3 men alive who shouldn't have been, and 1 woman who had walked away from an elite calling 2 years earlier, carrying a weight she'd never told anyone about, and who had picked that weight back up the instant it mattered, without waiting for permission, without needing anyone's approval. Because the math had been simple even if the decision hadn't been easy. She never spoke publicly about the recovery that had sent her out of pararescue in the first place. Some nights, sitting alone with the memory of a different ridge, she still felt its weight. But she understood now, in a way she hadn't let herself understand before that storm, that the ridge she had failed to save someone on didn't define what she was capable of. The 19 hours she had just lived through did. Colonel Fenn, for his part, quietly initiated the paperwork to have Merrick's records reviewed for reinstatement to an operational recovery billet. Not because she'd asked for it, but because he'd spent 22 years learning to recognize when the Air Force was about to lose something it couldn't afford to lose twice. Merrick hadn't decided yet what she'd do if that offer ever reached her desk. Some mornings she thought about the maroon beret and felt, for the first time in 2 years, something other than grief when she pictured it. Other mornings she thought about the packing tables, the quiet, honest work of making sure someone else's chute opened when it mattered, and she wasn't sure that job needed replacing with any other. She let herself sit with the not knowing, which was, she was slowly realizing, its own kind of progress. A week later, the rigger shop looked exactly the way it always had. Quiet, orderly, smelling faintly of nylon and machine oil, 4 workbenches lined with fabric and thread. Sloane Merrick sat at her usual station near the window. A fresh canopy spread across the table in front of her, lacing the lines through her fingers with the same unhurried, exact precision she brought to every rig that passed through her hands, as though the previous week had never happened at all. A young airman 2 tables down, new to the shop, glanced over at her with something like reverence and started to ask a question about the rescue. Merrick just smiled, small and private, and nodded toward the canopy in front of her. "Somebody's got to pack this one right," she said. "Doesn't matter what came before. The next chute's the one that matters." Outside, the flight line hummed with ordinary business. Aircraft taxiing, ground crews working, the world moving on the way it always does after the extraordinary becomes, briefly, ordinary again. But on that ridge, in the cold and the dark and the 19 longest hours of 3 men's lives, something had been proven that no title, no assumption, and no offhand remark about who does and doesn't jump would ever be able to take back. Some of the bravest people wearing a uniform are the ones nobody thinks to look at twice, until the night the sky falls in and they're the only ones willing to go up into it. If this story moved you, hit like, subscribe for more stories of the quiet ones who turn out to be the bravest in the room, and tell us in the comments, would you have hooked up and jumped, or waited for someone else to go first?